For more than a century, Maytag was Newton, Iowa. Its corporate address was called One Dependability Square, and its most famous employee was a repairman paid for decades to fix nothing. By 1924, one of every 5 washing machines made in America came from this one Iowa town, and at its peak, 1 in 4 people in Newton drew a Maytag paycheck. Then, on the 10th of May, 2006, a company in Michigan announced that the plant, the headquarters, and 1,800 jobs would all be switched off, ending the Maytag name after 113 years. That announcement said nothing about the summer soldiers armed with machine guns occupied Newton to break a strike. It said nothing about the automobile that nearly ruined the man who built the company, years before any washing machine carried his name. It said nothing about the fortune that quietly turned into blue cheese, made in a Newton dairy still running long after the washing machines stopped. And it said nothing about the bidding war that decided, in a matter of weeks, who would own the company that had built an entire American city. Chapter 1. 4 Men and $600. The story of a company that could silence an entire American town in a single afternoon does not begin with that silence. It begins more than a century earlier, on a bare lot in Newton, Iowa, inside a stove works that had already failed once. In 1893, that stove works stood empty, its ovens cold, its machinery long since sold off or scrapped, its previous tenant gone under. Newton was a farm supply town in those years, a courthouse square and a rail depot ringed by the wheat and oat fields of Jasper County, and a failed foundry on its edge was not, by itself, remarkable. Empty buildings like it stood all over the farm belt then, monuments to ventures the local economy had not been able to carry. Into this one walked 4 men carrying a business plan slight enough to fit on a single sheet of paper and money enough, barely, to test it. Each put in $600 of his own, $2,400 in all, drawn from George W. Parsons, 2 brothers named Bergman, and a 4th partner, F.L. Maytag. $600 was not a fortune. It was closer to the cost of a modest farmhouse or a year's wages for a hired hand, the kind of sum a cautious man risked once and did not risk twice. 4 signatures on 4 bank drafts, and a company on the strength of them. They called it the Parsons Band Cutter and Self-Feeder Company, chartered to build one unglamorous attachment for the threshing machines already working the fields of Jasper County, a device that cut the twine bands off bundled grain and fed it into the thresher without a hired hand's fingers anywhere near the blades. It was not a machine a farmer bought for his kitchen or his parlor. It was a machine bought, if it was bought at all, by a threshing crew looking to save an hour of labor and a finger during the one season of the year that mattered. What a founder owes the town he sets his business inside is a question this film will let stand on both its legs, not settle for him. One answer holds that a company owes its home nothing beyond wages paid and taxes filed on time. That sentiment has no line item on a ledger. Another holds that once a business writes its name across a settlement's power lines, its school levies, and its waterworks, it has signed something heavier than a labor contract, a debt that outlasts any single payroll. Newton, in 1893, had no way of knowing which answer its future held. Neither did the 4 men in a cold building counting out $600 apiece onto a borrowed table. Of the 4, only one would matter later. Maytag was not, in those first years, a name anyone in Newton set apart from the other 3. He was one signature among 4, one bank draft among 4, a partner in a firm built to make an accessory for somebody else's machine. Nothing about the building they had taken over argued otherwise. Its brick walls were scavenged from a failed venture, its windows patched with whatever glass could be had cheap, its floor still marked with the outline of ovens that no longer worked. It looked exactly like what it was, a ruin rented cheap by men who could not have afforded better. There was no sign over that door, no promise carved into its brick of the address the company would one day give itself in the same town. The firm those four men chartered made nothing a farmhand in Jasper County could not have built or bought elsewhere. It made a band cutter, a self-feeder, and hardware for the threshing crews who came through every harvest and moved on. Its whole ambition began and ended on the threshing floor. But the device that would carry the Maytag name into households across the whole of the country, the one that would eventually put a founder's name over a town he had not yet begun to own, had not been built. It was still years away. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Sideline That Swallowed the Company. Not yet, it turned out, meant only a few years. Within a decade and a half, the machine nobody at the founding table had thought worth mentioning was outgrowing the one the company had actually been built to make, and it was doing so from inside the same walls in Newton. The problem the Sideline was built to solve was arithmetic, not ambition. A band cutter and a self-feeder sold to threshing crews only at harvest, and the Jasper County harvest lasted weeks, not months. For the rest of the year, the machine shop stood mostly idle, its lathes and stamping presses bought for 12 months and earning their keep in 3, a foundry's worth of capital sitting quiet through the long Iowa winters while the debts on it kept coming due regardless of season. A seasonal trade needed a second product that farm families would buy in the slow months, something with no wheat crop attached to its calendar, and the search for it is what put a washing machine, of all things, on the drafting table of a company that had never built a household appliance. The first attempt reached the market in 1907. Newton's machinists called it the Pastime, a wooden tub washer turned by a hand crank, built on the same floor that had cut steel for band cutters and sold as a farmhouse convenience rather than a factory centerpiece. It asked a farm wife to do the same load of laundry with a crank instead of a washboard, nothing grander than that, and it was priced and pitched as exactly that, a way to keep the shop paying its own light bill between one harvest and the next. The second attempt, in 1909, corrected what the first had only tested. The shop turned out an improved washer called the hired girl, built to take over labor a farm wife, or an actual hired girl, had once done bent over a washboard on a back porch, and it sold well enough that the company behind it changed hands and changed its name in the same year. Maytag bought out the firm that had employed him as one partner among 4 and put his own name over the factory door. From 1909 forward, the works answered to the Maytag Company, its identity now tied to a machine built to fill idle months, rather than to the threshing attachment that had once been its whole reason for existing. A decade further on, the Sideline took its next leap. In 1919, the company introduced the first aluminum washer tub to come off a Newton production line, trading the wooden barrel of the Pastime for a lighter, more durable metal basin built for a household laundry room, not a farmyard workbench. Where the Pastime had been a shop experiment run off the same tooling as a threshing attachment, and the hired girl little more than proof that farm families would pay for the improvement, the aluminum tub was an engineering commitment, the kind an owner makes only in a product he intends to build for years, not merely to survive one more slow season. Here is the reversal the 4 men at that borrowed table could not have priced into their $600 apiece. The machine built to steady a seasonal trade had, within a generation, stopped being seasonal at all. What began as a hedge against the slow months had, by 1919, become the reason the plant kept its lights on, while the band cutters and self-feeders that gave the company its original charter receded toward a footnote in its own ledgers. A firm chartered to keep threshing crews supplied with attachments now bore the name of a man whose fortune would be made almost entirely by a machine meant, at the start, only to cover the months when threshing was over. The tail had not wagged the dog. It had eaten it, one wooden tub and one aluminum tub at a time. The sideline had swallowed the company that built it. It had not yet swallowed the town growing up around the factory gate, and the road to that reckoning ran through one detour the company would never choose to advertise. That detour was a machine built not to wash anything, but to drive. That gamble came next. Chapter 3. The Car That Nearly Ruined Him. That gamble came next, and it had nothing to do with a washtub. In 1909, the same year the factory door took his name, Maytag looked at a different machine entirely and decided he wanted to build that one too. In Des Moines, a small firm called the Mason Automobile Company was turning out early motor cars, founded by Edward R. Mason and engineered by two brothers, Fred Duesenberg and August Duesenberg, names that would later mean far more to American racing than a modest Iowa car company ever did. A washer, however well it sold, was still a farmhouse convenience. An automobile was the machine of a new century, the product every ambitious manufacturer in the Midwest wanted a stake in, and Maytag bought control of the Mason firm, moved fast, and put a washing machine man's money behind an assembly line that built no washers at all. Production moved north to Waterloo, Iowa, and from 1910 to 1912, the plant there turned out automobiles carrying the Maytag name, the badge of a wash machine maker, bolted now to a windshield and a set of wheels. For a man who had spent 16 years learning to read a farm town's seasonal buying, this was a bet on an entirely different customer, one chasing speed and standing rather than a lighter wash day. The stakes were personal, not only financial. The company Maytag had built up from an empty foundry barely 2 decades earlier now carried his own name over both a washer factory and a car plant, and a receivership judge weighing the automobile venture's books would be weighing the same name that hung over Newton's washer works. A washing machine maker who sold too few washers was an ordinary business failure. A washing machine maker whose own name went into receivership over an automobile was a different and far more public kind of ruin, and it was that second kind the car venture nearly delivered. The bet did not hold its shape for long. Orders for engine parts and body castings kept arriving at Waterloo, sized for a company expecting its sales curve to keep climbing, while the actual curve did the opposite. Month over month, showroom floors thinner than the tooling assumed they would ever be. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. A plant built for growth and fed by a market already shrinking under it does not correct itself, and the man who could read a threshing crew's calendar to the week had not yet learned to read an automobile buyer's. The parts kept arriving anyway. The company betting the shortfall was a season rather than a trend. It was not a season. By 1911, the automobile venture stood in receivership, its ledgers and its unpaid parts bills and its half-finished inventory handed to a court instead of a customer. The retreat that followed was total. The Waterloo plant was let go. The Mason name faded into a footnote beside the Duesenberg brothers' later fame, and Maytag turned the whole of his attention back to the one machine the company already knew how to sell. He had bet the firm on wheels and nearly lost it inside 3 seasons. He would not make that wager twice. What survived the wreck at Waterloo was not a car company. It was the discipline the near collapse had beaten into him. build the one machine the firm already understood, and stop chasing a second industry it did not. The washer left standing when the car plant closed was, by 1912, the only machine Maytag had left to bet on. Therefore, he bet everything on it. The company that had nearly died in a receivership court before it properly began was about to turn that one surviving machine, and the factory floor still humming behind it, into something no other town in Iowa could claim. Chapter 4. The capital of a single machine. The wager held. The Waterloo assembly line stayed dark, the automobile venture folded into memory, and Newton's factory floor, filled now with washtubs and wringers instead of engine parts, absorbed the whole of the company's attention. Through the remaining years of the decade, the machine repaid that bet faster than either the farm implement trade or the automobile detour ever had. Year folded into year on that single floor, the assembly line lengthening, the shipping dock crowded with crates that had not existed a decade earlier. Maytag was not the only manufacturer making that bet on Newton's own streets. Along the same rail sidings that had once hauled threshing machine attachments out of Jasper County, crates stamped with rival names began rolling out of warehouses of their own. 9 competing washing machine makers operated inside the same small Iowa town at once, each with its own floor, its own foreman, its own delivery wagons, all turning out washtubs for the same household market. A visitor walking Newton's main street then would have passed factory gate after factory gate, all promising the same relief from the same wash day, all drawing on the same pool of Jasper County labor. The town noticed what it had become and said so out loud. Newton took to calling itself the washing machine capital of the world, a title stamped onto letterhead and repeated in local boosterism long before the arithmetic behind it had fully arrived. It was, for a stretch of years, more slogan than fact. One rail town declaring itself the center of an entire American industry on the strength of 9 competing floors crowded inside its limits. Farmhouse kitchens elsewhere had never heard of Newton and could not have found Jasper County on a map, yet the wash-day machine already sitting in a growing share of those kitchens had come from a floor inside it. The competition did not hold that shape for long. One by one, the rival floors fell quiet, their foremen and delivery wagons gone, their names no longer stamped on crates moving along the sidings, while Maytag's own line kept expanding, kept hiring, kept shipping. Up to this point, Newton had been a town of 9 washer makers. That was about to flip. The pace did not slow as the smaller works dropped away. It accelerated. Year after year, the surviving line absorbing the market share the closed ones left behind, until the crowded factory district that had once housed 9 separate competitors held, in practice, only one working name. Rail cars left the depot loaded through those same years, each crate stenciled with the same name, bound for hardware stores and mail-order warehouses in states most of the men loading them would never see. What had once traveled those sidings as threshing machine parts, and then briefly as automobile bodies bound for Waterloo, now traveled them as washtubs bound for the whole of the country. By 1924, that survival had produced an arithmetic worth stating plainly rather than boasting about. 1 of every 5 washing machines sold anywhere in the United States, in farmhouse kitchens from New England to the Pacific Coast, carried the Maytag name and had rolled off that same Newton assembly line. A single Iowa rail town, 1 floor, 1 manufacturer's name, supplying 1/5 of an entire nation's laundry rooms. The company's own address changed to match the claim. What had been an ordinary manufacturing address on an ordinary street was rewritten across company stationery, shipping crates, and delivery invoices as One Dependability Square, a name meant to promise something no rival could match on a factory sign. A Maytag washer, once installed in a farmhouse laundry room, simply did not break down. Dealers writing in for parts or new stock now addressed their letters to a square that existed, in practice, nowhere but on Maytag's own letterhead. 9 rival firms once crowded into a single Iowa rail town. 1 in 5 washing machines sold anywhere in the country. The year, 1924. A corporate mailing address that no longer read a street number, but One Dependability Square. The arithmetic told only half of what had happened to Newton by the middle of the decade. A town that had once hosted 9 washer makers now hosted, in any meaningful sense, 1. Maytag was no longer a company that happened to occupy a building on the edge of town. It had become the reason the town existed at all, and what that would come to mean for the people who lived inside it was a story the arithmetic alone could not tell. Chapter 5. 1 in 4 belonged to Maytag. The company ledgers had already answered what Maytag was to Newton. It was not a business occupying a piece of the town, but the reason the town held its shape. What those same ledgers could never answer was what that reach felt like once it crossed the threshold of an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, a question no balance sheet was built to hold. By the middle of the decade, 1 of every 4 people living in Newton drew a living, directly or through a household member, from the same Maytag payroll. Not 1 family in 4 sending a single wage earner through the gate each morning, but nearer to 1 person in 4 counted straight across the whole town, carrying a Maytag paycheck as the reason a given household ate. The pattern repeated down the same streets. A father on the assembly line, a neighbor in the shipping yard loading crated wash tubs onto the rail cars, a cousin behind the counter of a hardware store that stocked little else but Maytag parts. The company that now held that many households did not answer to F.L. Maytag alone. His son, Elmer Henry Maytag, known thereafter as E.H. Maytag, had risen to the company presidency, and under his hand the town's dependence on the factory hardened into something closer to a private arrangement between one family's company and an entire county's labor. A workforce that size did not merely draw wages from Maytag. It looked to Maytag in ways no smaller Newton employer had ever been able to command, for what a town otherwise supplies for itself. Maytag gave it steady hours, a functioning Main Street, a reason for a young couple to build a house in Newton rather than leave Jasper County for Des Moines or Chicago. That reach did not stop at the factory gate. A store on Main Street selling overalls or work boots or Friday night groceries was, in practice, selling to the same payroll twice removed, its own survival tied to a wage packet it had no part in setting. A church collection, a schoolhouse levy, a bank's willingness to write a mortgage on a modest house, all of it moved in step with a single company's fortunes. No institution in the town stood fully outside the company's shadow, not because Maytag had reached out to claim them, but because a workforce that large left almost nothing in Newton for it not to touch. The town kept its own time by the plant. A whistle mounted above the assembly line roof marked the opening of a shift and the closing of one, a single sound carrying down every residential street and telling a household, with no clock of its own to consult, when to set the supper table. Children walking home from a schoolyard learned to read that sound as plainly as a church bell. And men walking toward the same gate, morning after morning, wore a path into the streets that no map of Newton needed to mark, because everyone already knew where it led. Payday arrived out of the company offices on a fixed schedule and moved through the town like a change in weather. The grocers stocked their shelves ahead of it. The collection plates came back fuller in its wake. A family that had gone without through the back half of a pay period allowed itself on payday the one purchase it had been waiting on. None of this felt strange to the people living inside it. It was simply the shape a life took in a town built around a single factory gate, ordinary enough that nobody thought to name it until the day it stopped. But the same whistle that could call a town to work could just as easily call it to nothing, and the same payday a household set its calendar by was a payday one company alone controlled, granted by no authority Newton had any hand in choosing. Newton did not resent the arrangement while it still felt mutual, the factory paying the town and the town keeping the factory staffed in return, each side trusting the other could not easily do without it. E. H. Maytag ran a company so thoroughly woven into the town's streets and storefronts and church calendars that neither could any longer picture itself without the other. But a company that has made itself that indispensable to a town has every reason to defend the arrangement rather than lose it, whatever defending it might eventually cost the people on the other side of the gate. E. H. Maytag had inherited a payroll large enough to run a small county's worth of households, and a company that size does not surrender ground. It has spent a generation acquiring without a fight. What it would prove willing to do in defense of that place arrived within the decade. In a summer, the plant whistle and the fixed payday had given the town no way to see coming. Chapter 6. The Summer of the Machine Guns. The part of the arrangement no ledger in Newton had ever needed to spell out was what the company would do if the men on its own assembly floor ever tried to bargain with it as equals, rather than as a grateful payroll standing under a factory whistle they did not control. 1938 supplied the answer, and it did not come from anywhere Newton expected to look. That year, the Maytag Company posted a wage cut of 10% across the Newton assembly floor, a notice handed down from the front office to men who had spent the better part of a decade setting their households' clocks by the same shift bell. The workers, organized under the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, Local 1116, roughly 2,500 of them on the Newton payroll, answered the notice the way an organized shop answers a pay cut. They walked off the line. A picket went up at the gate within days, hand-lettered signs held by men who had until recently measured their whole lives by that gate's opening and closing. The company did not restore the cut. The picket line did not come down. Deliveries into the plant slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Talks opened between the Union Hall and the front office and produced nothing either side would sign. Along Main Street, storefronts that had built their trade around the Maytag payroll felt the strike almost as fast as the strikers did, a receipt book thinner than any payday it had recorded. Days on the line became a week, then more than one, the same faces returning to the same stretch of sidewalk morning after morning, and the standoff that had opened as a dispute over a single number on a paycheck hardened week by week into something closer to a siege laid against the plant that had built the town around it. If that were the only pressure on the company, it might have waited the strike out. But something else was moving toward Newton that neither the strikers nor the front office had been watching for. It arrived from the state capitol. Governor Nelson G. Kraschel, watching a wage dispute in one Iowa manufacturing town harden past the point local authority could manage, called out the Iowa National Guard and declared martial law over Newton, placing an American company town under military command to settle an argument over 10 cents on the dollar. Martial law was not a word Iowa reached for lightly, and it was not aimed that summer at an invading army or a natural disaster. It was aimed at Newton's own citizens, gathered at Newton's own factory gate over a wage cut posted by the one company that owned that gate. Newton had known National Guard uniforms only from parades down Main Street. That summer it learned what they looked like standing at a factory gate instead. 4 companies of the 113th Cavalry Regiment rolled into Newton, army trucks and mounted units filling residential streets that had never carried anything louder than a shift-change whistle and a payday crowd. One of the 4 came equipped with machine guns, and those guns were set up within sight of the same gate the local 1116 pickets had walked for weeks. Soldiers stood watch where Union men had stood watch the week before. Horses and army trucks took up the curb space where delivery wagons had once queued for the loading dock, and families who had never seen a soldier outside a newsreel now watched them from their own front porches. The company town that had organized its whole day around a factory whistle now took its orders from an army command post, and the soldiers camped in Newton had not been sent to defend the town from any outside threat. They had been sent to hold one company's machinery safe from the very people who ran it, in the same streets where those people also raised families, banked mortgages, and filled the church pews the Maytag payroll had helped keep full. Under an occupying force that answered to the state capital and not to Newton, the picket lines could not hold. Men who had walked off the assembly floor over a 10% cut now faced armed soldiers, standing between them and the same gate they had once passed through every morning without a second thought. And within that armed occupation the strike broke. The gate reopened. The line resumed under guard. What the wage cut had cost the company in dollars, the Maytag ledgers could tally easily enough. What the occupation cost the men who had walked that picket line survives, so far as any record of it remains, in a single sentence one striking worker left behind about the soldiers stationed at his own factory gate. "I never worked under bayonets, and I never will." A sentence like that does not undo an occupation once the machine gun company has broken camp and the assembly line is running again under guard. The soldiers eventually withdrew, the way an occupying force withdraws once the point has been made and the machinery has not stopped. The strike ended. The wage cut, by the company's own choosing, stood. Main Street's shop windows filled again the same week the whistle resumed its old schedule, and to anyone glancing in from outside, Newton by autumn might have looked exactly as it had before the strike was ever called. It was not. A town that had spent a generation trusting a single company to keep its whistle running and its paydays steady now carried something new alongside that trust. It carried the plain, witnessed knowledge of what that same company was prepared to call in against its own workers. In the streets, those workers also called home to keep what it had built. That knowledge did not stay contained to one broken picket line and one occupied summer. It rode forward into every year Maytag and the town would spend together afterward, a fact the company town could no longer unknow, and a debt the years ahead had not yet finished collecting. Chapter 7. The Cow That Outlasted the Company. The debt that Machine Gun Summer left on the company's ledger was not the only account the Maytag family had quietly been building in Newton. A second one had been growing for almost 2 decades already, on a stretch of pasture at the edge of town, and it had nothing to do with an assembly floor, a picket line, or a National Guard company at all. It began in 1919 when E.H. Maytag bought a single Holstein Friesian cow to keep his own household in milk. The animal grazed behind a fence line a few miles from the plant gate, black and white against the Iowa pasture land, unconnected in anyone's mind to the washing machines rolling off the line downtown. Over the next 2 decades, that one cow multiplied into a herd, and the herd grew into a prize-winning line of cattle grazing the same family pasture year after year, the kind of quiet hobby a wealthy manufacturer's son could afford to keep on the side without anyone reading much into it. To a town watching the plant gate for its own news, a rich man's cattle were simply cattle, a paddock nobody thought to put in the same sentence as a factory. E. H. Maytag did not live to see what the hobby would become. He died in 1940, and the prize herd passed, with the rest of his estate, to his two sons. Frederick Louis Maytag II, known from then on as Fred Maytag, and his younger brother, Robert Maytag, inherited a pasture full of cattle and a choice about what to do with it. They did not sell the herd off as a curiosity or let it scatter into other men's barns. In 1941, the year after their father's death, the brothers founded Maytag Dairy Farms, converting the pasture hobby into a working dairy on the same ground where a single cow had once grazed alone under the same family name that hung over the plant gate downtown. What they built there was not simply a dairy selling milk and butter off a farm truck. Working from a process patented by two microbiologists at Iowa State University, Clarence Lane and Bernard W. Hammer, Maytag Dairy Farms began aging a blue-veined cheese from its own herd's milk, hand-turned wheels wrapped and set aside to cure. The first wheels of Maytag blue cheese left the dairy in October of 1941, a food product carrying the same surname stamped across washing machine nameplates in half the households in America, made by a family enterprise that had never manufactured an appliance in its life and never would. Newton took little public notice. A dairy herd and a wheel of cheese read as a family curiosity in 1941, worth a passing line in the county paper, and nothing more from a town whose whole attention still ran through the plant gate. Nobody toasting those first wheels that October had any reason to guess why a later chronicle of the family might one day circle back to a pasture and a cheese wheel rather than a factory floor. The dairy has kept operating in Newton in the decades since, a Maytag enterprise standing quietly apart from the machines that made the family's fortune, on its own terms and its own timetable. But in the autumn of 1941, almost no one in Newton was counting cattle or cheese wheels. Every eye in the company town still ran through the plant gate, where the machines carrying the Maytag name remained the only thing anyone meant by that word, and where the promise stamped into every one of them was about to be given a face of its own. Chapter 8. The Repairman with Nothing to Fix. The promise stamped into every washing machine leaving that assembly line had spent decades as a fact on a factory ledger. By the time Fred Maytag stood at the head of the appliance company his father had left behind, that same promise was about to be given a face the whole country would recognize, and the face belonged to a man paid to do nothing at all. Under Fred Maytag, the company reached the height of the reputation the founders had spent 2 generations building. The Newton plant turned out washers and dryers to a standard the whole industry measured itself against, and every machine leaving the line went through inspection routines built around a single obsession. Nothing shipped that could come back broken. The corporate offices wore the same word the machines were sold on, printed on the letterhead, painted on the delivery trucks, repeated in the national advertising that ran in magazines and on radio for years before television gave it a face at all. Reliability was no longer a selling point among several. It was the entire pitch, distilled into one claim repeated on every appliance showroom floor in America. A Maytag simply did not break down. In 1967, that claim got its television face. The actor Jesse White stepped into a pressed service uniform, sat down inside a mocked-up repair shop built for the cameras, and became Old Lonely, the Maytag repairman with nothing to fix. The set told the joke before White said a word. A wall of wrenches that never came down, a service truck parked and idle in the garage, a telephone on the wall that refused to ring. The premise was the whole argument in miniature. A company employing a professional repairman whose working day was spent staring at a clock because the machines he was hired to service refused to fail. White played the part with the patient, hangdog resignation of a man condemned to boredom by his own employer's excellence. And the joke only worked because the underlying claim was one Newton itself had been making with a straight face for years. The character did the work no factory tour or annual report could do. It took an abstract manufacturing standard and put a bored, salaried face on it one American households could recognize on sight and repeat to a neighbor at the appliance counter. Inside Newton, the campaign was not treated as advertising copy dreamed up by an agency somewhere else. It was treated as a fair account of the town's own working life, spoken back to it from a television screen in the living rooms the plant workers went home to every night. Reliability had stopped being a department's job. It had become the town's civic religion, practiced on every shift at the plant and preached nightly into households it had never visited. A brief note before the story returns to Newton. This channel, Empire of Acres, follows the families, companies, and towns that built real power somewhere in America and traces what it cost them to keep it. The Maytag Company and the town it built are one record in that history, not the last one. Anyone who wants the next chapter delivered without having to go looking for it can subscribe to Empire of Acres now, free of charge, and the story picks back up in Newton either way. By the early 1970s, within a few years of that first appearance, the idle repairman was as familiar a face on American television as any actor selling anything, and Fred Maytag's company had what almost no manufacturer ever gets, a national audience willing to repeat its central promise for free. The reputation was no longer confined to washing machine showrooms or to Newton's own city limits. It belonged to the whole country's idea of what dependable meant, and the company owned the word outright. That was the danger sitting inside the achievement, though nobody in Newton was positioned to see it yet. A company that sells reliability as its entire identity has made a promise it must keep forever, against every rival smart enough to copy the standard and every buyer patient enough to wait for the standard to slip. The repairman with nothing to fix was a triumph of advertising precisely because it dared the world to prove it wrong, and a dare like that does not stay unanswered. The plant gate, the delivery trucks, the letterhead, the idle repairman on the screen, all of it was built on a promise of permanence, and the market the company sold into was under no obligation to honor a promise it had never signed. Chapter 9. The rivals closed in. The market had never signed the promise printed on the company's own letterhead, and inside Newton's boardroom windows the difference began, slowly, to show. The part that did not make sense, not at first, was how ordinary the threat looked. No rival stormed the plant gate. No headline on a Newton newsstand announced a war beginning. The danger arrived instead the way water finds a crack in a foundation, a little further in every year, until the floor the whole company had always stood on had shifted underneath it without a single visible crack on the surface. This was no longer a story that belonged to Newton alone. Across the American appliance industry, and then beyond American borders altogether, the same pattern was repeating in boardroom after boardroom, in city after city far from Iowa. Family-built manufacturers, raised the way the Maytag Company itself had once been raised, one town and one product line at a time, were folding year by year into larger corporate parents answering to shareholders scattered across the country and, increasingly, across the globe. Refrigerator makers merged with stove makers. Stove makers merged with dishwasher makers. Washing machine companies that had once competed only with the firm down the block found themselves competing instead against conglomerates that built everything under one roof and sold it out of the same showroom aisle. Profit margins on a washing machine thinned with every year that passed, squeezed from one side by retailers bargaining harder over shelf price, and from the other by rivals willing to undercut it. A brand that had spent 4 decades telling the country its machines did not need replacing was, by its own arithmetic, moving fewer units off the line than a competitor built on the opposite promise. Reliability, the very quality the Newton plant had perfected into something closer to a civic religion than a sales pitch, could still sell a reputation. On its own, it could no longer sell a balance sheet. Inside the company, none of this read as a warning posted on the factory floor. It read as proof of strength. A firm that had outlasted 9 competitors inside its own hometown decades earlier took that survival as evidence. It would keep surviving whatever came next, and the confidence hardened quietly into something close to celebration. Years before there was anything left in the ledger books to celebrate. It should not have. By the final years of the 20th century, the very traits that had once made the company a fortress, a single-product manufacturer still built around its founder's name, a payroll concentrated inside one Iowa town rather than scattered across a dozen states and 3 continents, had become, to a consolidating industry, exactly what made it a target. The company no rival had dared approach, while it stood as the largest name in the showroom, had grown, almost without anyone in Newton noticing the exact year it happened, into one of the smaller names left on the board, ringed now by corporate suitors several times its size, each one studying the same annual report and reaching the same conclusion. The circle of would-be buyers was no longer limited to other washing machine makers either. Investment firms that had never built a single appliance learned to read a factory the way Newton read a machine, not for what it made, but for what it was worth on paper, the brand name, the distribution network, the plant floor itself, all of it reducible to a figure on a spreadsheet that could be bought, restructured, and sold on again. Manufacturers on other continents, building washers and refrigerators for markets Newton's founders had never heard of, now had the capital and the ambition to bid for an American name as old as this one. A company that had spent a century thinking of its rivals as the firms across town, or at most across the state line, was about to discover its real competition had been assembling in boardrooms an ocean away. An independent that can no longer stand alone does not get to decide whether it will be bought. It only gets to decide, for a little while longer, who does the buying. Therefore, by the middle of the following decade, the company that had once owned an entire American town found its own ownership thrown open to negotiation, in a contest that would not be settled on the Newton factory floor at all, but in boardrooms and bidding sheets a very long way from Iowa. Chapter 10. The War to Own a Dying Giant. The buyers that had been circling in boardrooms an ocean away did not stay unnamed for long. In the spring of 2005, the first of them stepped out from behind the annual reports and put a figure on the table at a conference room stacked with due diligence binders and term sheets nobody on the Newton plant floor had been shown. That first offer came from Whirlpool, a private equity firm that had never built an appliance in its life, and it opened at $14 a share. A bid worth roughly $1.1 billion laid against every plant and product line still carrying the company's name. A price tag now hung over an Iowa assembly line the way one hangs over a piece of real estate on an auction block. Word of the bid reached Newton the way weather arrives from somewhere else, forecast first in a financial newspaper column, and only afterward in a town that had built its whole identity on believing the company answered to no one but itself. The four founders, who had once pooled $600 apiece to open a threshing machine shop, could not have pictured a summer when $600 would not buy a sliver of a single share in the company that grew out of that gamble. A century of dividends and washing machines had turned a Stoveworks partnership into a prize large enough for private equity spreadsheets on 2 continents to fight over. Ripplewood did not hold the floor for long. Within weeks, a second group answered. The private equity firms Bain Capital and Blackstone, joined by the Chinese appliance maker Haier, countered together at $16 a share. For the first time, a factory floor on the other side of the Pacific had a stake in what happened to a hometown gate in Iowa, and the arithmetic behind the company's own name was being rewritten in currencies its founders had never once had to think about. Then the company's oldest rival stepped into the room. Whirlpool, the appliance maker that had spent decades competing for the same shelf space in the same showroom aisles, opened its own counter at $17 a share and refused to be outbid. The number kept climbing through the summer, term sheet after term sheet, each new figure reported before the ink on the last had dried, until Whirlpool had gone as high as $21 a share, a bid worth about $2.7 billion once the debt already sitting on the company's books was folded into the price. None of the four bidders that summer were competing over how to keep the Newton assembly line running for another century. They were competing only over who would get to decide its fate from a boardroom nowhere near the plant floor, an irony that would not become visible inside Newton itself for several more months. $14 a share, 16, 17, 21, the number that finally won the room, $1.1 billion, then $2.7. A signed deal at $1.7 billion, cash and stock combined. When the bidding finally closed, the signed agreement did not carry the highest figure Whirlpool itself had spoken that summer. The company's board accepted a cash and stock package valuing the company at close to $1.7 billion, short of Whirlpool's own $21 peak, but still enough to clear every rival bid off the table and put a single signature on the paperwork. On the 1st of April, 2006, Whirlpool completed the purchase, and the company that had answered to its own name and its own Newton address since the 1890s now answered to a new corporate owner instead. Not one signature on that closing paperwork belonged to anyone who had ever punched a clock inside the plant. But a signed acquisition is not a decision about a factory floor. In Newton, the assembly line kept turning the morning the deal closed. The parking lots filled at the usual hour, the loading docks took the usual trucks, and the plant gates opened on schedule, exactly as they had the morning before and the morning before that. The workers who reported to their stations under a company flag that had just changed hands did not yet know what the new owner had decided to do with the town it had just bought outright. Chapter 11. The morning the town was told. The wait on the Newton plant floor did not stretch through the rest of that spring. Corporate memos began moving between Whirlpool's offices in Michigan and the plant gates in Iowa within days of the ownership change, though nothing in their wording reached past the executives who read them first. The parking lots kept filling at the same early hour, the same delivery trucks kept backing into the same loading docks, and the assembly line under the plant's water tower kept turning exactly as it had for generations. Nobody standing at a workstation that spring yet knew the new owner had already made up its mind. Then, on the 10th of May, 2006, barely 5 weeks after Whirlpool completed its purchase, the answer came down. Whirlpool announced it would close the Newton assembly plant and shut the company's Newton headquarters altogether, folding both operations into facilities it already ran out of state. The announcement did not travel as a single memo passed hand to hand across the plant floor. It went out as a public corporate statement, picked up within hours by the wire services and the regional television stations, so that much of Newton first learned what had happened to its own largest employer from the same evening newscasts watched 100 miles away. The executives who had spent careers running the corporation from its own Newton offices learned their positions were leaving with the letterhead. The announcement cut roughly 1,800 salaried jobs in all, the largest share at the Newton Headquarters and Research Center, the rest at Maytag administrative offices in Illinois, Canada, and Mexico. These were positions in finance, in engineering, in marketing, work that had never once touched the assembly line and would not survive it either. The Newton Headquarters building did not empty that same week. But the corporate life it had housed for decades had already been handed an ending date, months before a single box was carried out to a parking lot. News of that size does not stay behind a boardroom door in a town built around one company's address. It moved down Main Street the same afternoon, past the same storefronts the plant whistle had always used to mark a shift change, except this time the whistle had no part in it. Diner counters filled with the same conversation before the local newspaper's afternoon edition had even gone to press. Gas station clerks, school crossing guards, the pastor at the downtown church, the man who sharpened lawnmower blades on the courthouse square, all of them were repeating some version of the same handful of facts, because that week the town had, in effect, only one subject left to discuss. Retirees still counting on a company pension, downtown merchants who had built their trade around a payroll that arrived every other Friday, school teachers doing the arithmetic on how many desks in their own classrooms belonged to a Maytag household, all of them were doing the same math within the same week. For a town where, at its peak, 1 in 4 residents had drawn a paycheck from that same address, there was hardly a household left untouched, whether the job at risk sat behind a desk in the offices or on the line in the plant. The company and the town it employed had answered, in practice, to the same name off the same square for as long as anyone in Newton could remember. Maytag was Newton, Iowa, and on the 10th of May, the two of them were told, in the same breath, that they were ending together. 2 readings of that morning sit side by side, and the historical record does not choose between them. Was Whirlpool retiring a healthy, widely recognized brand it had just fought a bidding war to acquire, mainly to clear a competitor off its own shelf space? Or was it simply closing out a company that had already reached the end of its road inside an appliance industry consolidating around fewer and larger names? Both framings fit the same set of facts laid on the same conference room table, and neither one is settled here. Either reading rests on a narrowing of the field that had been underway for years before the 10th of May ever arrived, a current no single boardroom decision had started, and no single boardroom decision would stop. What is certain is smaller and harder to argue with. A presence that had lasted since the 1890s, that had opened as a threshing machine shop, outsurvived 9 hometown rivals, occupied its own town under martial law, and put its name on cheese, on automobiles, and on a national advertising campaign, had just been handed something it had never once been handed before: a date to stop. Chapter 12. The last machine off the line. A date to stop did not arrive that spring. It did not arrive that summer either, and through the rest of 2006 and into 2007, the assembly line beneath the water tower kept turning, the same stamped steel washer tubs and dryer drums rolling down the same conveyor belt toward the same loading dock, the plant's daily rhythm unbroken while a decision made in a Michigan boardroom sat waiting on paper 1,000 miles away. Then, in October of 2007, the wait finally ran out. That month, the last washer came off the Newton assembly line, its white porcelain shell moving down the same conveyor belt that had carried Maytag appliances out of Iowa for 100 years, and the last dryer followed it within the same shift. Both machines crossing the same loading dock trucks had backed into every working morning since the plant first raised its doors. The stamping presses that had shaped a century of steel tubs and drums went quiet behind them. The motors that had once run 3 shifts around the clock cut off for good, and the overhead lights stayed burning over an assembly floor that, for the first time in 100 years, had nothing left on it to build. Roughly 550 workers punched their time cards at the gate that day and crossed the parking lot for the last time, the crews still standing at their stations after every earlier round of layoffs had already thinned the roster from what it once was. Break rooms built to seat 3 shifts a day now held the settled quiet of a space sized for far more people than were left to fill it, and loading docks that had once queued delivery trucks bumper to bumper stood open and still. They were walking out of a building never built to hold so few. The Newton Works covered roughly 2 million square feet under a single roof, corridors and stairwells and assembly bays sized for a workforce many times the 550 who filed through the gate that October, their footsteps carrying down hallways built for a plant that no longer existed at anything close to its old size. Outside, the parking lot that had once needed staggered shift times just to keep the rows from overflowing held only a fraction of the cars it was built for, spaced out across asphalt, poured for a workforce the plant would not see again. Set that single October morning beside the numbers Newton had already been carrying since the spring before, and the full shape of what had ended comes into view in one tight accounting. Roughly 1,800 salaried jobs, gone with the letterhead the previous May, 550 line workers, gone with the last washer that October, 2 million square feet of assembly floor standing silent under one roof. 1 in every 4 residents of Newton at the company's peak, drawing a paycheck from that same address. 113 years, opened in an abandoned building and closed on an ordinary autumn morning with no machine left running inside to mark the difference. The plant gate did not come down that week, and the 2 million square feet behind it did not answer, on their own, what a town does with an empty factory and an address that had once explained where most of its own people spent their days. That question belonged to the seasons still ahead, not to the October morning the last motor cut off. Newton crossed its own parking lot that day owning nothing yet of an answer, only the plain fact of a machine that had finally, after generations, stopped for good. Chapter 13. What Outlived the Company. The seasons ahead did answer, though not in the direction the numbers from that October morning seemed to point. The plant gate had shut for good, but the town on the other side of it did not. Newton held its population near 15,000 people in the years that followed, not the emptied shell those closing figures might have predicted, and census counts kept listing the town within a narrow range of where it had stood before the shutdown, a place that had lost its largest employer, but not, the way so many single-industry towns do, most of itself. The shape that recovery took was scattered rather than singular. No single company arrived to fill Maytag's old footprint at once. Several smaller employers did, piece by piece, across the years that followed. In 2008, a wind turbine blade manufacturer named TPY Composites moved into part of the space the Maytag plant had vacated, hiring roughly 900 workers to build turbine blades stretching 187 feet from root to tip, longer than the production line that had once carried washers and dryers across that same floor. 900 jobs did not equal what the plant alone had once employed at its own peak, but they arrived at a factory floor that had, for a few years, employed no one at all. Where stamping presses had shaped steel tubs for 100 years, workers now laid up fiberglass panels the length of city blocks, and finished blades left the plant lashed to flatbed trucks built to carry a load that long, rolling out through streets. The same kind of trucks had once carried washers down decades earlier, bound for wind farms rising across the Iowa plains and beyond. Not far from that same floor, the Iowa Speedway opened its oval track to stock cars and to a crowd that had never had reason to drive through Newton before, filling grandstands on race weekends and motel rooms and diner booths along the way. Nearer the old company grounds, the building that had served as Maytag's world headquarters was leased out and put back to work. Its long corridors, once built to move paperwork between departments answering to a single company, now belonged to whoever leased the space next, its offices filled again by tenants with no washer or dryer to their name. Where a single company's name had once explained the whole town, several employers now did that work instead, none of them large enough on its own to stand in Maytag's old place. Newton's city government offered up to $10,000 in cash to any resident willing to build a new house within town limits, money aimed at the empty lots the layoffs had left scattered across the map. The Windblade plant hired back some of the same hands that had walked out the Maytag gate for the last time that October. Men and women who had once built washers 3 shifts a day, now building blades taller than the old assembly hall's own roofline. Some of them had grown up watching a parent walk through that same gate for a different shift, and now walked their own children past the same fence line on the way to a different one. New houses went up a few streets from the shuttered factory floor, paid for in part with the city's own money rather than any corporation's. None of it came from a promise a company in Michigan had made and kept. It came from people who decided, gate by gate and job by job, to stay. The company had once renamed its own headquarters address One Dependability Square, a name meant to promise that nothing built inside it would ever fail. That address still marks the building's front door today, unchanged by any of the tenants who have since moved through its offices. Some of the washers the company built there are still running in Newton basements, years after the company that made them left town. No plaque outside the old plant gate lists every name that once punched a clock there. Much of what the company meant to Newton now lives only in the people who worked there, not in any surviving corporate record. For anyone whose family once clocked in at the Maytag plant, or who grew up on a Newton street the company helped build, name the years below, and the job the company once gave your household. Of everything the company built in Newton across 113 years, only one product still carries the Maytag name off a store shelf today, and it is neither a washer nor a dryer. It is a wheel of blue cheese, aged in the same Newton dairy the family opened in 1941, packed and shipped out under a Maytag label a few miles from the old assembly floor, the one Maytag good the shutdown never reached. The company did not outlast itself. The cheese only had to keep aging.